Before I begin, let me thank you for being here. This channel is where we share stories that speak to the heart about family, about love, and sometimes about the painful lessons that come with them. If you find meaning in what you hear, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us. These stories are not just mine, they're pieces of life we all recognize. Today's story carries a title that already stings with truth. My son said he was too busy for Thanksgiving, so I donated the feast to strangers. Max was 59 years old, silver hair combed neatly, his hands worn but steady as he laid out china plates on the dining table. He wasn't a rich man, but he had a way of making a holiday feel rich. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, the gravy simmered softly on the stove, and the flicker of candlelight danced across the polished wood he had spent the afternoon rubbing to a shine. This was his season, the one day of the year he cherished most. Thanksgiving had always been about family, about gathering in the house his wife once filled with laughter. She was gone now, but her recipes lived on in the way Max folded napkins, in the way he basted the bird every half hour, in the way he hummed the same hymn she used to sing while peeling potatoes. He had done all this with one picture in mind, his son walking through the doorcoat still cold from the November air, maybe carrying a bottle of wine, maybe just bringing his smile. When the phone finally rang, Max's heart quickened. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, picked it up, and pressed it to his ear. "Hey, Dad," his son's voice said casual, almost distracted. "Son, the table's ready," Max said warmly. "I can't wait to see you tonight." There was a pause, a small pause that felt like a lifetime. Then the words came sharp, flat, unforgiving. "Dad, I'm too busy this year. Don't expect me." The dish towel slipped from Max's hand. His eyes flickered toward the table, the candles, the turkey, the carefully set places waiting for laughter that would never arrive. And in that silence between the crackle of the oven and the ticking of the wall clock, Max felt the weight of an invitation that had just been emptied of its meaning. Max didn't move right away. He stood in the kitchen, the phone still warm against his ear, though the call had ended. The house was too quiet for a night that should have been filled with footsteps and chatter. The candles flickered as if embarrassed by their own glow. He turned to the table, and his eyes caught the glimmer of the turkey knife. Its polished blade reminded him of another year long ago when he had barely been able to afford a bird at all. He remembered carrying his son, just 7 then, on his shoulders through the grocery store. The boy had pointed at the smallest turkey on the shelf, giggling that it looked lonely. That year, Max had worked overtime at the factory welding steel under buzzing lights, his back aching so badly he could hardly stand straight. But he had scraped together just enough for that bird, some potatoes, and a single pumpkin pie. He remembered the way his son had eaten 3 slices, laughing so hard he spilled whipped cream on his pajamas. The sound of that laughter echoed in his ears now, but it collided with the present silence. Echo and break. Past joy breaking into present emptiness. Max pulled out a chair and sat down, his rough hand resting on the tablecloth his wife had sewn years ago. His eyes wandered to the far end of the table where his son used to sit. He saw not just the empty chair, but every moment it once held a boy with mashed potatoes on his chin, a teenager reaching for the drumstick, a young man announcing he was bringing his girlfriend for the first time. And now nothing. His chest tightened as he looked at the spread bowls of cranberry sauce, glistening like jewels, the golden turkey steaming in the center, the soft rolls wrapped in a linen towel. All of it ready, all of it waiting for a family that no longer came. The clock ticked on. Tick. Tock. Each sound seemed to mock the time Max had spent preparing the time he could never get back. He whispered aloud, not to anyone, not even to the walls, but to the ghost of his wife who had once leaned against the counter, smiling. "I did all this for him. Always for him." The words hung in the air, fragile and breaking, as if daring the empty room to answer. The turkey's aroma filled the room, but to Max it tasted like loss. He sat at the table, his fingers tracing the stitching of the old tablecloth, his eyes locked on the untouched feast. The laughter of his son as a child echoed faintly in his head, then broke apart into the present silence. Echo and break. Outside, the wind pushed against the window panes, carrying the muffled sounds of neighbors gathering. Cars parked up and down the street, headlights flashing briefly through his curtains. Families were coming together, not tearing apart. The contrast stung. Max rose slowly, his chair creaking as if even the wood protested the loneliness. He walked to the counter and rested his hands on the back of the turkey platter. The warmth seeped into his calloused palms. For a moment he felt foolish, a man clinging to traditions that no one else wanted. He closed his eyes. In the darkness, another image surfaced: the night shifts, sparks flying in the factory, his hands blistered from welding. He had always told himself it was worth it, that his son's future would shine brighter than any steel he ever shaped. Sacrifice. Now betrayal. His chest swelled with something heavier than grief. It was resolve, slow but undeniable. He looked around the kitchen as though measuring the walls. The plates, the food, the candles, none of it deserved to rot under silence. He whispered, but this time his voice carried a weight that startled even him. If he won't come, then someone else will. He reached for his coat, hanging by the door. The movement felt foreign, as if he were stepping out of his old skin. His hand trembled when he picked up the keys, but the tremor steadied when he looked back at the spread one last time. The feast would not die here. Not tonight. The decision sat on Max's shoulders like a sudden weight lifted. He crossed the room with heavy, deliberate steps, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. Each sound felt like a drumbeat announcing change. He fetched the stack of aluminum trays from the cabinet, the kind his late wife used to save leftovers in. As he laid them out, the candle flames trembled in the draught shadows, swaying like witnesses to his resolve. The turkey's skin cracked gently as he carved into it, steam rising in white curls, carrying the scent of thyme and butter into the cold air. He could almost hear his wife's voice, soft, proud, reminding him that food was never wasted when given with love. The scrape of serving spoons against ceramic dishes echoed in the empty kitchen. Mashed potatoes, glossy green beans, cranberry sauce, glistening like jewels, each portion slid into trays with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. His rough hands moved carefully, steadying plates so they would not clatter too loud. The house listened. For a moment, he paused, catching sight of the framed family photo on the counter. His son at 8 years old, grinning with missing teeth, his wife's arm around them both. He touched the glass with the tip of his finger, then let his hand fall. That boy, the one who once clung to him, was gone. The man who said, "Dad, I'm too busy this year," had taken his place. Echo and break. Max snapped the lids shut, one by one, the metallic clicks cutting through the silence. His kitchen table, once set for family, now resembled a staging ground, a battlefield where grief was being turned into action. He slipped into his coat. The sleeves smelled faintly of cedar, from the closet a sharpness that steadied him. Under his arm he gathered the trays, their warmth seeping through thin foil, heating his side like a promise. The keys jingled in his pocket, a sound that once meant his son was coming home now, a signal that Max himself was leaving. As he stepped out, the night air bit against his cheeks, raw and cleansing. The porch light flickered above him, buzzing faintly as if uncertain whether to guide him forward or let him walk into the dark. Max gripped the railing, looked back at the empty house, glowing with abandoned candles, and whispered, "This meal won't die in here." Then he descended the steps, his boots striking the concrete with a rhythm that felt almost defiant. The trays pressed warm against his chest. The street was silent, but in his heart a different sound grew, an echo, not of loss, but of something beginning. The night pressed cold against Max's breath, frosting the air in silver bursts as he walked down Main Street. The trays under his arm radiated faint warmth, a strange comfort against the sharp November wind. Streetlights flickered one by one, halos of amber stretching across empty sidewalks. The town was quiet, houses glowing with their own feasts, families gathered, laughter muffled through curtains. Max kept walking. Each step echoed like a steady drum, bridging the silence behind him with the noise waiting ahead. At the end of the block, the brick shelter came into view, its paint peeling, its sign tilted slightly. A single light over the door buzzed faintly, the sound like a fly trapped in a jar. Shadows shifted in the doorway, figures hunched in coats too thin for winter faces, lined by the chill of waiting. Max's heart tightened. He had expected an emptiness like his own, but instead he saw eyes watching hungry cautious, as though they were unsure if hope really wore a dark coat and carried trays of food. He paused at the steps, gripping the railing with his rough hands. For a moment doubt whispered this was supposed to be for family. "What am I doing here?" The voice of his son returned sharp as glass. "Dad, I'm too busy this year." "Don't expect me?" Echo. Break. Max swallowed hard, climbed the steps, and opened the door. Warm air rushed out thick, with the mingled scents of damp coats, strong coffee, and the faint antiseptic tang of a building stretched beyond its mean. The hum of voices filled the hall, a low, restless chorus that quieted as the door shut behind him. Dozens of eyes turned their weight heavy but not unkind. A volunteer in a faded red sweater approached her, eyes wide at the sight of him at the trays balanced in his arms. "Sir, are you bringing those for us?" Her voice trembled between surprise and disbelief. Max knotted his throat too tight for words. He set the trays on the nearest table, the foil lids crinkling as he lifted them off, one by one. Steam unfurled into the air, turkey rich with butter mashed potatoes, smooth and pale cranberry sauce glowing ruby red under fluorescent lights. The scent spread quickly, wrapping the room, pulling people closer. For the first time that night, the silence broke, not with his son's rejection, but with gasps of gratitude. Chairs scraped as people rose, murmurs swelling like a tide. "Is this for us, an older man?" asked his voice rough from years on the street. Max looked at him directly, the words leaving his chest like a vow. "Yes. Every bit of it." The room stilled, then shifted. A child peeked from behind her mother's coat, eyes wide at the sight of the food. A woman pressed her hands together as if in prayer. The volunteer's hand rested lightly on Max's arm, grounding him. In that moment, surrounded by strangers, Max felt something his own son's absence had denied him. He was needed, not as a provider to be drained, but as a man whose giving still held meaning. He inhaled deeply, the mix of scents, coffee dust, roasted herbs, filling him with a strange, fierce calm. He straightened his shoulders, the trays now empty, his heart suddenly full. The trays had barely touched the table when the air in the shelter shifted. Hunger had always lived here, quiet and patient. But now it flared into something else, hope edged with disbelief. The volunteer in the red sweater lifted the first ladle, her hand shaking as she scooped out a mound of steaming potatoes. She looked at me as if asking permission. I gave a small nod, and the spoon fell heavy onto a paper plate. A child's hand reached out first. Small fingers' nails chipped, trembling slightly as they wrapped around the plate. Her mother whispered, "Say thank you," but the child's wide eyes were already locked on me, bright with a wordless gratitude. Echo. Break. For a second I saw my own son at that age, his hands reaching for the first slice of turkey I ever carved. That memory cracked against the present, sharp and merciless, yet somehow necessary. Plates filled one after another. The smell of roasted turkey mixed with the scent of old coats, the scrape of plastic forks against paper, the soft sighs of people who hadn't eaten a feast like this in years. Across the room, an older man lifted his fork and closed his eyes after the first bite, as if he were tasting not just food but dignity itself. The angle shifted, one woman's tears dripping onto her plate, a young boy tapping his fork against the table in rhythm, the murmur of strangers turning into conversation. The meal was more than food. It was a bridge connecting people who had come in as shadows and were now lit with the small fire of belonging. I stood back, my coat still dusted with frost, my hands empty. For years I had prepared Thanksgiving, waiting for my son's chair to be filled. Tonight, those chairs had multiplied the table, stretching beyond my living room, beyond bloodline. And as I watched strangers eat, I felt something break inside me, not in pain, but in release. "Sir," the volunteer whispered, her voice low but urgent. "They'll remember this night. Not the hunger, not the cold. This. You gave them Thanksgiving." Her words struck deeper than my son's rejection had. Because here among people with nothing I wasn't dismissed. I wasn't forgotten. I was seen. The plates kept passing, laughter rising, forks clinking. The room filled with a sound I hadn't expected to hear this year, joy. The shelter had grown louder as the night deepened. The scrape of chairs, the clatter of trays, the low hum of stories being exchanged, it all pressed against the thin walls until it seemed the building itself was breathing with life. I thought the night would stay contained there inside that square of brick and flickering light. But whispers like wind through a cracked window have a way of escaping. Outside, a man who had once worked at the post office lingered by the door plate in hand, steam curling up into the cold. He spoke to a woman passing with her groceries. "Did you hear some old fellow brought a whole Thanksgiving here?" Every dish, every plate. She paused, shifted her bags, and glanced at the doorway where laughter spilled out like music. A group of teenagers walked by on their way home, skateboards tucked under their arms. They stopped, noses twitching at the smell of turkey and cinnamon. One peeked inside, saw the crowded tables, the faces lit with gratitude, and muttered, "That's actually—" I didn't know it then, but the story was already traveling. From one mouth to another, carried by surprise, by admiration, by the strange warmth of hearing that generosity still existed in a world that often felt too cold. Inside, I caught fragments of voices. "It's been years since I've had pie. This feels like family. Who did this?" I stayed quiet, letting them build their own stories. I wasn't looking for recognition, only to see plates emptied and spirits lifted. But recognition has a way of finding you when you least expect it. A local journalist, tipped off by a volunteer's cousin, slipped in quietly, notebook tucked beneath his arm. He stood at the back, scribbling, catching details. The worn coat I wore, the way I stood without sitting to eat the crowd around tables, once meant for far fewer. His pen moved fast, as if he already knew this was more than a meal. It was a message. The room glowed with contrasts. A child giggling with a full belly, an old woman holding her fork as if it were treasure, a young man bowing his head before eating, whispering a prayer to no one and every one. Each angle was a shard of a larger mirror, reflecting something I hadn't planned but had stumbled into the feast, had turned into a kind of gathering place for dignity itself. And as the whispers grew, spilling out of the shelter and into the cold streets of town, I felt a tremor of something larger than myself. I had set a table for strangers, but perhaps without knowing it, I had invited an entire community to witness what Thanksgiving was meant to be. Morning didn't come gently. It arrived with voices outside my window, neighbors, speaking in tones too curious to be casual. I stepped onto the porch coat, drawn tight, and saw Mrs. Carter from across the street, pointing toward the shelter a block away. A line had formed there longer than the night before. People who hadn't set foot inside a church or charity hall in years were gathering not only for food, but for the story they'd heard whispered through alleys and diners. I walked slowly toward the shelter boots, crunching frost, and each step seemed to draw another face from the shadows. A shopkeeper with flowers still on his apron, the high school history teacher with his tie loosened, even Officer Ramirez from the night patrol. They weren't there for a meal. They were there because something rare had happened, something worth witnessing. Inside, the tables had been cleared of last night's crumbs, but the air still carried the weight of turkey cinnamon and the laughter that had clung to the walls. Volunteers buzzed around, setting out coffee, slicing what remained of the pies. But it was the new arrivals who shifted the air. They came not with empty plates, but with offerings of their own: a basket of apples, a pan of cornbread, a pot of chili steaming in the cold. "Thought you might need more," the shopkeeper muttered, sliding the basket onto the counter. "One meal shouldn't be the end of it." I stood near the doorway, unseen by most watching, as the feast I had carried alone began to grow arms and legs, multiplying through others' hands. It struck me like an echo. What started as a quiet rebellion against my son's indifference had become a gathering louder than any holiday table I'd ever dreamed of. A young boy tugged his father's sleeve, pointing to me. Is that the man who brought the food? The father gave me a nod of respect, and for a brief second I felt something heavier than pride. It was a weight I hadn't expected: responsibility, but the good kind, the kind that binds strangers together like family. Then the journalist from the night before returned, camera slung over his shoulder. He snapped photos of the mismatched crowd: teachers beside laborers, officers beside men who slept on benches. His lens captured the variety of faces bent over steaming plates, The quiet miracle of a town forgetting its divisions for one meal. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't planned to lead anything. Yet, here it was, a community table stretching beyond wood and nails, made of trust, need, and the stubborn insistence that gratitude could be shared. As the hum of voices swelled, I knew the story was no longer mine alone. The town had claimed it, carrying it further than I ever could. By Monday morning, the shelter still smelled faintly of roasted turkey and nutmeg, but the tables were bare again. I thought the echoes of that night would fade quietly, tucked away in the memories of those who had come. But the newspaper kiosk at the corner betrayed me. Bold black letters stretched across the front page. Father turns Thanksgiving into town feast after son's refusal. Below it, a photograph me carrying the turkey tray, head bowed against the cold, flanked by children with paper cups of cider. I froze, paper in hand, as passers-by slowed to glance at me, then at the photo, then back again with quiet nods. Walking home, I heard the ripple everywhere. At the hardware store, two men argued about whether they had seen me hauling pies in the snow. At the diner, a waitress told a customer, "That's the man." Right there. Fed half the town. Their voices didn't sting. They steadied me like beams holding up a sagging roof. But the echo reached further than I expected. By evening, my phone, silent for days, buzzed with numbers I didn't recognize. Radio hosts. A local TV station. Even an email from a church 2 towns over asking if I could speak at their Thanksgiving service. The story had broken out of our streets, running faster than I could follow. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the paper spread wide. My son's absence was there, too, invisible ink between the lines. Each sentence about generosity carried its shadow, his refusal, his words, "Don't expect me." The echo and break worked like a drumbeat in my chest, what I had lost, what I had given, and what had grown in its place. Late that night, as the snow thickened against the window, another message arrived. This one I recognized. My son's name lit the screen. No dad in the greeting, just saw the paper. "Can we talk?" I held the phone until my hand trembled, the glow of the message flickering against the dark. For years I had chased his attention. Now for the first time it was chasing me. I didn't answer. Not yet. Some silences have to stand heavy and deliberate, so the weight of their meaning is felt on both sides. The phone kept buzzing through the weekend, but I let silence be my answer. By Monday night, the snow had hardened into crust along the sidewalk, crunching under boots, as neighbors came by to drop off pies, leftover rolls, even a quilt someone had sewn as thanks. Their kindness filled the empty corners of the house like warm air after a draft. But not every sound carried warmth. Just after dusk, a sharp knock rattled my front door. Not the polite tap of a neighbor bringing stew, but the heavy insistence of someone who believed the house and the man inside still belonged to them. When I opened it, there he was. My son. No phone screen, no buffer. Just his face, pale against the cold eyes darting past me into the house, like he expected to find his seat still waiting at the table. He didn't smile. He didn't hug me. He just said, "Dad, we need to talk." Behind him, headlights idled at the curb. His wife sat in the passenger seat, arms folded, her silhouette stiff. The car engine hummed like an impatient witness. I saw the papers. He continued, stepping inside without waiting. "You made a spectacle of us." His voice carried both accusation and something shakier beneath, fear maybe, or shame. I looked at him, my own son, standing on the rug he'd once stained with cider when he was 10. Now his shoes left melted snow and salt. A symbol. What had been childish clumsiness had hardened into adult disregard. I didn't make anything I said steady. I just opened my door where others would have closed it. He flinched. "You could have called me. We could have fixed this before it got public." Public. The word landed heavy. For him, this was about image, not absence. About the story in print, not the story at our table. I shifted angles, seeing him now not just as my son, but as a man caught between two mirrors, the one reflecting his ambition, the other reflecting what he had abandoned. "You told me not to expect you," I said, voice tightening. "The world filled the chair you left empty. He sat down hard at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once cut his turkey into small pieces. His hands fidgeted with the salt shaker. His eyes flicked toward the fridge, the counter anywhere but me. Dad, I was busy. Work's insane. You know how it is? The words were thin rehearsed, like thread pulled too tight. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the wood, and for the first time I let silence stretch between us, until even the hum of the refrigerator felt like judgment. Then I said low but firm, busy doesn't erase blood. Busy doesn't erase love, but it can starve both if you let it. He swallowed hard, throat working. His eyes finally lifted, but the courage wasn't there yet. From the street, the car horn tapped once, his wife calling him back. He rose slowly, leaving the chair, pulled out the salt shaker, still crooked. At the door, he turned his voice smaller now. Dad, don't shut me out. I didn't answer. Some lessons needed silence more than reply. When the door closed, I sat at the table he'd left half disturbed, running my hand over the wood grain. I felt the echo and break inside me, the ache of his absence, and the strange fullness left behind by strangers who had become family for a night. The night stretched on, but I didn't tremble. For the first time in years, the confrontation hadn't broken me. It had clarified me. The chair my son left behind stayed pulled out for a day, then two. I didn't push it back. It became a marker, an empty witness to the words that had passed between us. Every time I walked by the table, I felt both the sting of his absence and the echo of the feast that strangers had filled. By Wednesday, the air had turned sharp, the kind that stings your lungs when you breathe too deep. I decided to walk to the church at the edge of town. The steeple rose above bare branches, bells chiming faintly in the cold. The town was small, but its church always felt larger than life when silence pressed on you. Pastor James was there, sweeping the front steps, his breath rising like smoke. He straightened when he saw me, his lined face softening. Max, he said, voice warm. I read the story in the Gazette. You did something good last week. I shifted, embarrassed. I wasn't looking for attention. He leaned on the broom handle, studying me. That's why it struck people. You weren't grandstanding. You just opened your doors. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. I remembered how many Thanksgivings I'd sat in that church with my boy when his legs were still short enough to swing off the pew. I don't know if it matters, I said. Not to him. He thinks I embarrassed him. Pastor James motioned to the wooden bench beside the church door. We sat, shoulders hunched against the cold. The bench creaked under our weight. Son, he said quietly, family has a way of mistaking sacrifice for obligation. People only see the gift when it's gone. The words sank deep like stones into a riverbed. I thought of the turkey, the pies, the laughter of strangers. I thought of my son's eyes avoiding mine and how his wife honked from the car as if love could be measured by how quickly he came running. Pastor, I asked, almost whispering, do you think he'll ever understand? He looked out at the frost glittering on the lawn. Maybe. But you can't build your hope on his awakening. You've built a life on sacrifice. Now it's time to build one on dignity. His words were both balm and blade. I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing the faint hum of traffic beyond the churchyard, the distant caw of a crow circling above. When I opened them, I saw Eleanor, the retired schoolteacher, walking up the path with a bag of canned goods for the food pantry. She stopped when she saw me. Max, she said, I just want to tell you what you did. It reminded me of the Thanksgiving dinners we used to give the kids when their parents couldn't afford much. You made this town proud. Her voice trembled. So did her hands as she pressed the bag against her coat. That small gesture, that quiet validation filled me more than any seat at my son's crowded table ever could. Two witnesses in one afternoon, different voices, same truth. Their words layered like boards on a bridge, carrying me further from doubt, closer to a kind of strength I hadn't let myself claim. That night when I returned home, the chair was still out waiting. I didn't push it back. Instead, I set a single candle on the table and lit it. Not for him. For me. For the man I was becoming, steadier, clearer, less afraid of the silence. The candle on my table burned low through the night, its flame flickering against the window until dawn light swallowed it. I hadn't moved the empty chair, and I didn't plan to. It stood like a scar, quiet reminder that absence can be louder than presence. By morning, the silence in my house pressed too heavy, so I walked down to Millie's Diner, the same spot I'd taken my son on Saturday mornings when he was just a boy and thought pancakes were a miracle. The bell above the door jingled, and the familiar smell of bacon grease and coffee wrapped around me like a worn blanket. Millie herself stood behind the counter, her hair pinned up apron already stained with the day's work. She spotted me and waved me over with that knowing smile only small-town folks can wear. "Max," she said, pouring a steaming cup before I asked, "I've been meaning to tell you. Folks are still talking about what you did with that Thanksgiving feast." I lowered myself onto the stool, the vinyl sighing beneath me. "I didn't do much," I muttered. "Just moved a meal from one table to another." She shook her head, sliding the cup toward me. "No, you gave people a reason to feel seen. That's more than most do." The spoon clinked against the cup as I stirred. In the reflection on the window, I saw the outline of the chair I had left behind at home, as if it had followed me, refusing to be forgotten. At the booth near the window sat Henry, an old co-worker from the factory where I'd spent most of my life. His hands were gnarled now, but I remembered them steady on machines, strong enough to lift steel but gentle enough to help me fix a broken lunchbox for my boy years ago. "Max," he called out, his voice rasped with years of smoke and work. I read the paper. "That was you, wasn't it, feeding those families?" I turned, nodding, not used to my name being linked with anything worth talking about. Henry leaned closer over the table, his voice lowering but carrying a weight that struck me. "I remember all those double shifts you pulled. You said it was for your kid. Said you didn't want him to feel what you felt growing up. You kept that boy clothed and fed even when you came home too tired to eat yourself. Don't let it make you think you're not enough." The words echoed, then broke something inside me. Echo and break. I gripped my cup tighter, steam rising against my face, hiding the sting in my eyes. Millie came over, resting her hand lightly on the counter, her touch grounding. "Max, sometimes kids forget the roots that held them steady, but the town hasn't. Don't you forget either." Through the diner's big window, I watched the street. Cars rolled by, people waved as if my quiet act had stitched itself into the town's fabric. And I realized the truth, while my son pulled away, the world outside had pulled me closer. The sound of forks clattering, the hiss of the griddle, the faint hum of an old jukebox. In the corner, it all wrapped around me like an anthem of ordinary life. Yet beneath it ran a deeper current, a promise that the climax of this story wouldn't be played out in silence at my table, but out in the open, where absence and presence would be measured not by blood, but by witness. When I left the diner, the cold air hit my face sharp and clean. The empty chair waited at home, but it no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a symbol. And I was learning how to carry symbols into battles my son never imagined I could fight. The cold followed me from Millie's Diner back down Maple Street, but it wasn't the kind of chill that begged for a coat. It was the kind that reminded you you were alive, that breath still left your chest like smoke curling into the air. As I turned the corner toward home, I noticed Eleanor sitting on her porch. She lived 3 houses down, a widow like me. Her porch light always left burning, though no one ever seemed to visit. She lifted her hand and called Max. "You've got a minute?" I walked over, crunching leaves under my boots, the smell of chimney smoke drifting between us. Eleanor patted the rocker next to hers, and I sat, the wood creaking beneath my weight. "I saw the paper, too," she said, her voice low, steady. "That story about you donating the Thanksgiving feast. I want you to know I wasn't surprised." Her words caught me off guard. Surprised, I asked. She looked at me with those clear gray eyes, the kind that didn't flinch. "No. You've been doing that your whole life. Just quieter. I still remember the winter my furnace broke. Nobody else knew, but you left a stack of wood by my back door. Didn't even knock. Just left it there." The rocking chairs creaked together like an old duet, her memory stitching into mine. I had forgotten about that winter, how my son was small then, and I carried him on one arm while hauling logs with the other. She leaned closer. I see your boy drive past here. Headlights on, eyes forward, never stopping. I don't know why he doesn't see you, but I do. And so does this town. Her voice echoed, then broke me again in that way I had come to know echo and break. The anger in my chest shifted not away but into something sharper. I looked out across the street where kids tossed a football in the yard, their laughter cutting through the late afternoon air. The ball slipped, bounced, and rolled toward us. One of the boys shouted, "Mr. Max, can you throw it back?" I stood, picked it up. The leather felt worn warm from their hands. My arms, stiff with age, pulled back, and I hurled it harder than I thought I could. The ball sailed true, the boys cheering. For a moment my hands remembered what they were built for, not just to provide, but to pass something forward. Eleanor smiled, nodding at the scene. See, you're still giving. Even when you think you've been emptied. Her words landed heavier than the ball itself. In that rotation of angles, her porch, my house, the children's yard, I understood that my story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to anyone who had ever given without being seen, who had ever waited at a table with an empty chair. The wind picked up, whistling through the branches overhead. I stood tightening my jacket. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said, "for remembering." She reached out, squeezing my hand with the quiet strength only someone who had lost much could carry. "Max, don't you forget it either. Sometimes family isn't who eats at your table. It's who notices you built it." As I walked back toward my front steps, the porch light behind me still glowing, I knew her words would follow me inside. And the empty chair in my dining room would no longer be a wound, it would be a witness. The next morning, the porch light outside Eleanor's house still glowed faintly, a steady reminder of the words she had left with me. I brewed coffee and sat at my table, staring at the empty chair across from me. For once, it did not accuse me. It simply waited like a silent witness to the day. A knock broke the stillness. When I opened the door, Pastor Jim stood there, bundled in his wool coat scarf tucked into the collar. He had baptized my son years ago, back when Sundays were not yet an inconvenience, but a gathering of hearts. "Max," he said, smiling gently, "I heard about the dinner you shared with the shelter. Mind if I come in?" I nodded, stepping aside. He walked in slowly, eyes taking in the dining room where the turkey pan still rested clean on the counter, the scent of cinnamon faint in the air. He touched the back of the empty chair. "Funny thing about these," he said softly, "chairs tell stories. This one doesn't look empty to me. It looks honored." His words rippled through me, echo and break. That chair had once been my wound. Now it became a symbol. We sat together, steam curling from our mugs. "Pastor," I said, my voice rougher than I expected. I raised my boy on this table. Every scratch on the wood, every candle burned low on Thanksgiving, every plate I filled, it was all for him. And yet when I needed just his presence, he said he was too busy. Pastor Jim didn't rush his answer. The clock on the wall ticked steady as breath. Finally he leaned forward. "Max, you didn't lose Thanksgiving. You gave it. That's different. Sacrifice has a strange way of circling back. Sometimes not through the people we expect, but through those who watch quietly." His eyes met mine. "The town saw what you did. More than that, the children at the shelter will remember. That is a legacy stronger than any slight from a son." I swallowed hard. My hands clenched, the mug heat seeping into my skin. For a moment, I saw it from above the arc rotated. Not just a father abandoned, but a man whose giving had spilled over, filling cracks he hadn't meant to touch. "Do you know what hit me hardest, Pastor?" My voice broke into the silence. Not that he didn't come, but that he didn't think my table mattered anymore. He reached across, laying his hand over mine. "Max, the table matters. Look around. Eleanor sees it. The kids on the street see it. I see it. And God surely sees it. Don't confuse neglect with invisibility. You are not invisible." The weight of his words pressed tears against my eyes, but I held them. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the branches against the window like a chorus agreeing. When he left, Pastor Jim paused at the doorway. "One more thing," he said. "Sometimes God empties a chair, so we'll see who else belongs at the table." Don't be afraid to feel it differently. As the door clicked shut, I stood in the quiet, the echo of his voice still stirring inside me. The empty chair wasn't a reminder of rejection anymore. It had become an invitation waiting for the right hands, the right hearts, the right gathering that was yet to come. The pastor's words lingered long after he left. His hand on mine, the steady assurance in his voice, the idea that an empty chair could also be an invitation, it all stayed with me like the faint scent of wood smoke on a coat after a long fire. That Saturday, the shelter director called. Her voice was full of warmth, but also urgency. "Mr. Mack's people haven't stopped talking about the dinner you brought. The children keep asking about the man with silver hair who carved the turkey. Would you consider joining us again, maybe this time at the community hall?" Her words were simple, but something in them tugged at me. A bridge had formed between my quiet kitchen and the larger town beyond. When I arrived at the hall, the place buzzed with a different kind of light. Rows of folding tables stretched across the floor, their surfaces lined with mismatched plates, steaming casseroles, and pitchers of cider. The scent of roasted vegetables mingled with cinnamon rolls. The murmur of voices blended with laughter that shook loose from tired throats. I carried in a tray of pumpkin pies, the crusts, golden sugar, dusting their tops like a thin frost. Children pointed. One little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered, "That's him." I felt my ears burn. I took a seat near the front, and for a moment I was simply another man with flowers still under his fingernails. But soon the director tapped the microphone. Feedback crackled, silencing the room. "Friends," she said, "Thanksgiving is about gratitude, but also about the hands that make gratitude visible." This week, one man reminded us that a table isn't defined by who refuses to sit at it, but by who is welcome to it. Her eyes found me. I froze, every muscle taut. "Max," she called, "would you join us here?" The room shifted. Dozens of faces turned. My feet felt heavier than stone. But I walked forward, the squeak of my shoes against the polished floor, echoing in the hush. I stood behind the podium, staring at a sea of expectant eyes. And then I broke the silence. "I set my table last Thursday for someone who never came," I said, my voice rough but clear. "My son told me he was too busy." At first, that emptiness felt like a wound. But I brought the food here, and for the first time, I saw a table full of laughter, of children licking cranberry sauce from their fingers of hands that hadn't touched warmth in too long. I realized the feast hadn't been wasted. It had been waiting for the right family all along. A hush hung heavy, then rose into applause. Some clapped with their palms sharp and fast, others softly, as if cradling the truth of it. A boy no older than 10 raised his hand shyly. "Mister," he said, "can I sit at your table?" Next time the question pierced me like light through a shutter. For a heartbeat my throat closed. Then I nodded steady. "Yes. Next time you'll sit at my table." The crowd erupted again. Echo and break the words I had once dreaded, "Don't expect me," were now turned inside out by a child's simple request. As I stepped down, a woman touched my arm. Her eyes shone. "My husband and I haven't had a Thanksgiving meal in 3 years. Tonight, we felt like we belonged again. Thank you." I walked back to my seat, the weight in my chest loosened, replaced by something unexpected pride, fierce and unshakable. The hall was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing table. And I was no longer just a father rejected at his own. I was part of a larger family, one that had been waiting in silence until someone dared to open the door. The applause from the town hall still rang in my ears when I stepped outside into the cool night air. The November wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp leaves brushing against my face like a reminder something had shifted. Inside, laughter still rolled like a tide. But beyond those walls, the story was already escaping, carried on whispers, moving faster than I could imagine. By Sunday morning, I saw it in the way people looked at me at the corner store. A cashier who usually rang up my groceries without a word paused, her eyes bright. "Mr. Max, I saw the photos," she said softly. "What you did, it gave this town back Thanksgiving." Her voice cracked on the last word. Behind her, a man with a worn cap nodded in agreement. "You turned a lonely table into the whole town's feast." I didn't know there had been photos. But then I saw them on a neighbor's phone on the bulletin board at the diner, already spreading on social media. Me standing stiff at the podium, silver hair catching the light, my hand resting on the microphone, as if I were anchoring myself. My words quoted in neat little captions. The feast wasn't wasted. It had been waiting for the right family all along. Arc variation pulled the rhythm tighter, while inside I had spoken with a calm born of release. Now the world outside spun with noise, repeating my words back to me, with a reverence I had never known, not even from my own blood. Echo and break, don't expect me, my son's voice replayed, jagged as glass. But now it was countered, drowned out by the voices of strangers who said we needed you. By Tuesday, my phone buzzed. Not with calls from the shelter, not with thanks from townsfolk, but with a name I had been waiting for, Daniel. My son. A single text blinked on the screen. Dad, what's going on? People keep tagging me in photos of you. Did you really serve our dinner to strangers? I stared at the words. My thumb hovered above the keyboard, but I didn't reply. Not yet. Some answers needed to be heard, not read. That evening, as I stepped onto my porch, headlights swept across the driveway. A sleek car pulled in his car. Daniel climbed out, his tie loose, his expression unreadable in the half-light. For years I had imagined reunions filled with warmth. Now the silence between us was heavy, broken only by the crunch of gravel under his shoes. Dad, he said, his voice low, strained. Is it true you gave away Thanksgiving? I met his eyes, and for a moment I saw not the successful man in a press suit, but the boy who once tugged at my sleeve to carve the turkey first. My hands tightened on the porch rail. Yes, I answered, my voice carrying steady into the night. I set a table and you said you were too busy. So I found those who weren't too busy to share it. He flinched. The words struck harder than I intended, but truth rarely lands softly. Inside the house, a single candle flickered on the kitchen table. Its light spilled through the window, illuminating the empty chair still waiting. The same symbol that had cut me open days before now glowed like a sentinel. Daniel's eyes caught it, and for the first time he looked unsettled. Dad, he whispered, everyone's talking about it. The whole town. Even my boss asked me if I was the son who was too busy. Do you know what that feels like? His voice cracked, half anger, half shame. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so the night itself could hold it. Do you know what it feels like, I said, to wait at a table you built with your own hands, only to be told you're not worth the time? The silence that followed was the sharpest climax yet. Not applause, not whispers, but the unbearable weight of a truth neither of us could escape. Daniel stood frozen on the porch, the cold wind pushing at his coat as though urging him to step inside to face what he had avoided. But he didn't move. His eyes kept drifting toward the glowing window, toward that empty chair at my kitchen table, the candle burning like a witness to every word between us. Daddy began, then stopped, swallowing hard. His voice carried both accusation and shame. You didn't just feed strangers. You made me the stranger in my own town. Arc variation shifted the rhythm where before there had been silence. Now his words tumbled out fast, like water breaking through a dam. People at work, neighbors, they look at me like I abandoned you. They say I left you alone on Thanksgiving. Do you know how humiliating that is? I let him speak. His anger wasn't truly anger, it was fear, it was pride cracking. My hands curled into fists at my sides, then unclenched, remembering how tightly I had once held that wedding band of his mother's until it cut into my skin. Echo and break, I heard as too busy again, but it broke differently this time, echoing back, not as rejection, but as confession. Daniel, I said, stepping down the porch steps until we were face to face. The whole town saw me feed strangers because you left me with a table no son should ever leave his father at. You worry about humiliation. I lived it. I set a feast for family and ate with ghosts. He dropped his gaze, his shoulders tightening. For the first time, I saw him falter. He wasn't the polished professional now, but a man exposed by the weight of his own choices. Behind us, the streetlight flickered, casting shifting shadows across the gravel. The world itself seemed to tilt between him and me. Symbolic variety layered in the candle in the kitchen, burned steady. The streetlight trembled just as our bond swayed between endurance and collapse. Dad, he whispered softer now, his voice trembling. I didn't mean I didn't think I cut him off gently, not with cruelty, but with a finality he could not mistake. You didn't think because you didn't have to. For years I carried the weight. I gave time, money, and presents without asking for anything but one meal together. And when I finally asked, you gave me nothing. His jaw clenched. He looked at me as though searching for a crack in my resolve the way a child once searched for forgiveness in my eyes. But I didn't bend. Rotation of angles, suddenly I shifted my perspective inward first person. As the climax demanded, I stood there holding his gaze, feeling the years of sacrifice pressing against my chest. And for once I did not flinch. I had given him everything a father could give. Tonight, the world knew it. He knew it, and I would not apologize for refusing to be invisible anymore. Daniel's breath fogged in the cold air. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to answer. His silence spoke louder than any excuse he could have offered. And from somewhere down the street I heard a door open. A neighbor stepped out onto their porch, watching the way townsfolk do when the private becomes public. Daniel saw it too. His mask slipped further. Not just a son facing his father, but a man exposed before a community that had already judged the truth. The candle still burned in the window, steady, unwavering, waiting for no one. The next morning, the town felt smaller. Whispers followed me from the post office to the corner store, not cruel, but sharp with curiosity. Word had traveled fast, Max. The man with the Thanksgiving feast, the father whose son was too busy. I tried to shake it off, but by evening the unease returned. The diner's neon lights glowed against the night, and I decided to stop in for coffee. As I pushed the door open, the bell jingled and conversations dipped. Faces turned, farmers, clerks, the pastor, even the sheriff at the counter, all of them had heard. And then Daniel walked in. He froze when he saw me sitting by the window. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Then he squared his shoulders and crossed the room. The rhythm broke his steps, sharp, mind steady. Dad, he said, his voice carrying more loudly than he intended, you've made me a laughingstock. His words cracked the quiet. Every head in the diner turned. The waitress stopped pouring coffee. Even the jukebox hummed lower, as if straining to listen. I didn't answer right away. I let the echo hang laughingstock, a word meant for him, but now bouncing back on me. I remembered another echo, don't expect me. Daniel, I said finally, my voice calm, but caring you did that to yourself. I didn't tell the town you left me alone. They saw it. They saw who sat at my table and who didn't. Symbolic variety cut through the air, the steam from my mug rising like truth itself, the silverware clinking as someone set down a fork, the hum of the heater steady against the growing storm in his eyes. He leaned closer, jaw tight, trying to whisper, but too angry to keep it low. You didn't have to parade it. Feeding strangers. Letting everyone know I didn't parade anything, I cut in, my voice firm now, rising just enough for the room to hear. I shared what was wasted. I gave to those who were hungry. And if the town saw that it's because generosity shines brighter than excuses. Rotation of angles, suddenly I felt the eyes of the room, their perspective pressing against us, the judgment not mine alone, but theirs too. I shifted inward first person. As the heat of climax demanded, I looked at my son across the table. His face flushed with anger, and I felt the weight of years of sacrifice, of meals, shared, of laughter, once filling these very booths. And I saw how far he had drifted, measuring me now, not in love, but in humiliation. I would not bend to that measure any more. Daniel's hand trembled as he pointed at me, voice cracking. You chose them over me, and there, the break his words cut through, but the room broke it with their silence, their disbelief. I leaned back, letting my hands rest flat on the table, rough and steady. No, son. I chose dignity over neglect. And if that feels like I chose them over you, maybe it's because they valued what you threw away. A murmur rose around us. The sheriff sipped his coffee. The pastor nodded almost imperceptibly. The public climax had arrived not in the shouting, but in the quiet agreement of witnesses who saw sacrifice and betrayal laid bare under the diner lights. Daniel looked around, realizing for the first time it wasn't just me he was facing. It was a community that had seen both sides. His lips parted, but no words came. His pride faltered, and for the first time he looked small, not my son grown, but my son lost. The diner bell jingled again as a gust of cold air swept in. I didn't look back. My eyes stayed on him steady as the candle that had burned in my kitchen window the night he said he was too busy. The night at the diner had left cracks in Daniel's pride, but not defeat. I saw it in his eyes as he stormed out, shoulders stiff, fists clenched. The echo of his accusation, "You chose them over me," still rang in my chest as I walked home beneath the pale winter moon. But I knew this wasn't the end. By morning, the town was alive with chatter. At the bakery, whispers curled with the smell of fresh bread. At the hardware store, hammers paused mid-swing. The scene at the diner had spread like wildfire. I felt the shift. What was once private between father and son had become a story carried by the whole town. That Sunday, I went to church. Not for spectacle, but for the steadiness of routine. The hymns, the wooden pews, the flickering candles that reminded me of Margaret, my late wife. But when I stepped out after the service there, he was Daniel standing at the foot of the church steps. He hadn't come to pray. He'd come to reclaim something. "Daddy," called his voice, cutting across the crowd of parishioners filing out. "Tell them the truth. Tell them you didn't do it out of kindness. Tell them you did it to shame me." The hush fell heavy. Children stopped tugging on coats. Old Mrs. Fletcher clutched her hymn book tighter. The pastor, hands still on the church door, froze. I looked down at Daniel from the top step. For a moment I felt the weight of generations, how once I had carried him on my shoulders the same way I now carried his judgment. Rotation of angles, suddenly I wasn't just a father, I was a witness to my own life, a man measured not by his bloodline, but by the eyes of his community. I took a breath, my voice even steady enough for all to hear. "Daniel, the truth is simple. You were too busy for your own family. I didn't shame you. You did that yourself." He stepped forward, red-faced, his words breaking apart. "You don't understand. I have responsibilities, pressures you never had." I felt the break, then the crack in his argument. Echo answered echo. Once years ago, I had said the same words to my own father, and he had looked at me with the same mixture of sorrow and steel. I leaned into first person now. As the climax demanded, I looked at my son, and I saw not just his anger but his fear. The fear of being measured against the love he had neglected, the fear of facing a town that saw through his excuses. My hands trembled at my sides, not from weakness but from the effort of holding back years of pain. "Son," I said, voice rising so even the bells in the steeple seemed to listen, "I built my life on sacrifice, not shortcuts. I carried you when your legs were weak. I fed you when your plate was empty. I stayed when times were hard. Don't tell me about responsibility. You abandoned it the moment you told me not to expect you." Symbolic variety struck through the air, the hymn book slipping from Mrs. Fletcher's hands with a soft thud, the winter wind rattling the church's wooden door, the sharp cry of a crow overhead like judgment from the sky. Daniel faltered. His lips moved, but words deserted him. His pride bled out in silence. And then the townspeople moved, not with anger, but with a subtle rotation. The pastor stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. The sheriff gave a short nod. Even the children, wide-eyed, seemed to understand something too heavy for their age. The public climax wasn't in my defiance. It was in their quiet siding. Daniel stood alone at the bottom of the steps, smaller with every second, as if the whole town had turned the mirror on him. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply held my ground, the church doors at my back, the community before me, and the truth anchored in my chest. The silence that followed Daniel's retreat down the church steps was louder than any outburst. He left with his head low, but the weight of his words lingered like smoke after a fire. I didn't chase him. Some roads a man must walk alone, but I knew I had to turn that broken moment into something whole. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the dim light throwing long shadows across the untouched platters I had prepared. The turkey rested cold in the pan pie's untouched silverware, still shining in their folded napkins. The feast I had built in hope now looked like a monument to disappointment. Arc variation pulled me inward. Part of me wanted to lock it all away to eat in silence, to prove nothing. But another part, the louder part, whispered that love unused curdles into bitterness. My wife had always said, if family turns you away, widen the table. Her voice was a lantern in the dark. The decision was made. By morning, I was on the move. I loaded the dishes into the back of my truck, the cool air biting my hands, the scent of roasted meat and spiced pumpkin trailing into the dawn. As I drove toward the edge of town, each mile felt like shedding grief, like turning sorrow into motion. The homeless shelter stood by the river, its bricks weathered windows fogged by the breath of too many souls searching for warmth. I stepped inside, arms laden with trays. Conversations faltered, heads turned. A child's eyes widened at the sight of the pies. Echo and break cracked open the room once I had dreamed of my son sitting at this table, carving the turkey, raising a glass to family. Instead, here I was carving it for strangers. Yet in their faces I saw something Daniel had forgotten: gratitude. A man with a ragged coat pressed my hand. "Nobody's ever brought us a Thanksgiving like this," he said, voice rough with disbelief. A young mother wiped her daughter's face and whispered, "Thank you, sir. You don't know what this means." The shelter filled with sound forks against plates, children laughing prayers mumbled between bites. The cold outside seemed to melt against the heat of bodies gathered close. Rotation of angles. One moment I stood at the head of the table serving. The next I stepped back, seeing the scene from afar, a hall glowing with light, faces lifted as if a family had been stitched together from broken threads. Symbolic variety burned brighter than any sermon. The turkey knife clinked against the tray, echoing like a bell of renewal. The pies, sliced into thin pieces, became more than dessert. They were symbols of division turned into multiplication. I felt my chest tighten, not with regret, but with release. For the first time that season, my feast had a home. And then the pastor from church arrived carrying a few parishioners behind him. Word had spread. They didn't come to judge, but to join. They set down extra loaves of bread, more blankets, and their presence wrapped the shelter in a deeper warmth. I stood, hands trembling, not from sorrow now, but from the magnitude of it all. I raised my glass of water and spoke aloud. Family isn't just who shares your blood. Family is who shares your table. The room stilled, then broke into applause. Not loud, not staged, but the steady rhythm of hands meeting in agreement, like rain falling on a dry roof. For once, I didn't feel the absence of my son. I felt the presence of something greater. Public climax reached its crest, not in the rejection of blood, but in the embrace of community. And in that shelter by the river, I found Thanksgiving again. The next morning, as frost still clung to the grass, I walked downtown to buy a newspaper. The bell above the shop door jingled and heads turned, not in the casual way they used to, but with something sharper, like recognition. Mrs. Carson from the bakery raised a hand. "Max," she said, "what you did yesterday was the most beautiful Thanksgiving I've ever heard of." I froze, the words catching me off guard. Word had spread. Echo and break whispered in my ears. For years I had been the quiet man who kept his head down, the one who never asked for applause. But now, stories of the shelter feast had flown faster than the November wind. What had been born from sorrow had become a mirror for others. By afternoon, the small town seemed to hum with it. At the hardware store, men who usually talked about lumber and nails stopped to shake my hand. At the diner, a waitress set down my coffee with no charge. "On the house," she said, "for the man who reminded us what Thanksgiving means." Arc variation carried me between angles. Sometimes I felt lifted by their praise, other times humbled, almost embarrassed. But I couldn't ignore the ripple. Something had shifted, not just in me, but in how others saw me. The symbolic variety grew stronger in every gesture. A child's crayon drawing slipped into my coat pocket that read, "Thank you, Mr. Max." A church bell ringing in the distance, as if to bless what had happened. Neighbors leaving pumpkins on my porch, tokens of gratitude that smelled faintly off cinnamon and earth. And yet within this warmth a colder shadow lingered. "Daniel." From different lips I heard the same refrain. Where was your boy? Didn't he come home? How could he miss this? The town's kindness toward me had turned into questions about him. Some voices carried disappointment, others judgment. And though I didn't speak ill of my son, silence itself became its own verdict. I saw it in Daniel's world too. At the gas station, a friend of his muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Too busy for Thanksgiving, but not too busy for a football game." The words cut sharper than I wanted, but I didn't correct them. A father protects his child, but a man must also let truth stand. Rotation of angles brought me to the church again on Sunday morning. I sat in my pew, head bowed. When service ended, the pastor paused his sermon to speak. One man's empty table became a full shelter. That is what gratitude looks like. His eyes swept the congregation, and though he didn't name names, I saw heads turn toward me, and then inevitably toward Daniel, who sat stiff near the back. The public climax rose again, not in my words this time, but in the collective echo of a town. My act had become a story larger than me. As I walked home that day, a group of children ran past, laughing, one calling out, "Thank you, Mr. Max." Their voices rang against the cold sky, bright as chime. And in that moment, I realized something both heavy and freeing. I had lost my son's presence, but I had gained something he could not give me: respect, belonging, and the knowledge that love given freely never truly goes to waste. Still, the silence of my phone pressed harder than applause ever could. The town's praise still rang in my ears, but when Sunday afternoon faded into quiet, I found myself steering the old truck down a familiar road, the one that led to the cemetery. The applause, the drawings, the pastor's words, they all meant something. But there was one place where I needed to lay it all down. The air was sharp, the trees bare, their branches scratching at the sky like tired hands. I carried with me a small bouquet of chrysanthemums, the kind my wife always loved, their scent faint but stubborn against the cold. My boots crunched over gravel until I stood before her stone, the name weathered but clear. I knelt, placed the flowers, and whispered into the November wind. "You'd have laughed at me yesterday. Me of all people feeding half the town, when I couldn't even get my own son to sit at the table." Echo and break struck again the memory of Daniel's voice. Don't expect me breaking against the sound of children at the shelter shouting, "Thank you, Mr. Max." One bomb. The arc variation inside me shifted, pride, grief, release. I let them move like tides, not holding back. I traced her name with rough fingertips, calloused from years of work, and felt the chill of the stone seep into my skin. "I thought Thanksgiving would die with your empty chair," I said, my throat tightening. But it didn't. It just found a new home. Symbolic variety filled the moment, the flowers at her grave, the echoes of the church bell in the distance, the town's respect carried in the wind. Even the smell of damp earth rising from the ground seemed like a reminder life roots itself where it can. I shifted my weight, looking up at the gray sky. "He's lost Mary," I confessed. "Our boy is lost. Maybe one day he'll see. But until then, I can't keep setting the table for someone who never means to come." Rotation of angles pressed me inward, then outward. From the grave to the shelter, from silence to applause, from being just a father to becoming a man among neighbors. My grief was mine alone, but my actions belonged to everyone touched by them. For a moment I felt her there, not in voice but in stillness, like the warmth of sunlight on a cold day. I stood brushing the dirt from my knees. "I'll be all right," I told her, though maybe I was telling myself. I've learned love doesn't end at bloodlines. Sometimes it's found in strangers who call you family. As I walked back to the truck, the wind lifted the chrysanthemums' petals, scattering them across the ground like small blessings. I didn't stop them. Some things are meant to be carried away. And for the first time in years, the silence riding beside me on the drive home was not loneliness. It was peace. The day after I visited Mary's grave, I thought life might settle into its quiet rhythm again. But by midweek, Pastor Collins knocked on my door with a grin that carried news. "Max," he said, brushing the cold off his coat, "the shelter dinner you gave, it's still being talked about all over town. Families who came that night haven't stopped telling the story. We want you to come to the community hall this Saturday. No speeches, no pressure. Just let us honor what you did." At first, I hesitated. My instinct was always to keep my head down, to let the noise pass. But something in his tone, gentle yet insistent, told me this wasn't about me alone. It was about what we had all felt that night. Saturday came with a steady drizzle, the kind that made the streets glisten like mirrors. I walked into the hall expecting a modest crowd. Instead, it was full neighbors, church members, shopkeepers, even kids clutching paper drawings of the dinner. The smell of cider and roasted chestnuts lingered in the air, mingling with laughter that warmed the wooden beams overhead. I froze near the doorway until a woman waved me over. "Mr. Max," she said, pressing her hands around mine. "You don't know me, but my boys ate that night. You gave them more than food. You gave them dignity." Her words hit like an echo and break the sting of Daniel's dismissal. Don't expect me colliding with this stranger's trembling gratitude. For a second, my throat burned with unshed tears. Arc variation filled the hall, children running between tables, elders sharing quiet stories, the band softly tuning guitars in the corner. Each layer of sound and motion reminded me that this wasn't about absence anymore. It was about presence multiplied. Then the pastor called me forward. My hands trembled slightly as I walked the wooden floor, creaking beneath each step. He placed a small wooden plaque in my hands, carved with simple words to Max, for reminding us that Thanksgiving belongs to everyone. Symbolic variety sharpened the moment. The plaque's weight against my palm, the faint strum of guitar chords rising, the golden light from the chandeliers falling like blessings over the crowd. Every detail stitched itself into memory. I turned facing faces that weren't mine by blood, but now felt like kin. My voice came rough but clear. "I set a table hoping for my son," I said. "Instead, I found a town." Maybe that's what Thanksgiving really is, choosing to sit with whoever shows up hungry, not just the ones we expect. The hall erupted in applause, not polite but thunderous, heartfelt, rolling like a tide. Children clapped with open palms, elders wiped their eyes, and for a brief moment I felt Mary's hand on my shoulder, steady and proud. Rotation of angles completed itself, the camera of memory zooming out from the solitary man at a grave to the man standing in a hall, surrounded, claimed by a community that had turned his loss into shared hope. And as the guitars picked up a tune and voices rose in song, I sat at a table full of strangers breaking bread without loneliness. For the first time in years, Thanksgiving had no empty chair. It only had room. That night, after the applause faded and the last chair scraped across the wooden floor, I walked home beneath the drizzle. The street lamps cast long reflections on the pavement, as though every step had a twin shadow reminding me where I had been. My hand still carried the weight of the plaque, though it was light enough to tuck under my arm. Inside the house, silence pressed against me, not the lonely silence of before, but the stillness of a room waiting to hear what I might finally say. I placed the plaque on the mantel where Mary's photograph rested, the two pieces of wood, one carved by hands, one framed around her smile, sitting together as if they had always belonged. I made tea and sat at the old oak table, the same table where I had folded napkins, polished silver, and dreamed of Daniel walking through the door. Tonight the table carried only a single lamp, its circle of light like a stage. A blank sheet of paper waited in front of me. My fingers trembled as I lifted the pen. For years I had written checks for rent-wired transfers, for groceries, slipped folded bills into Daniel's hand. Tonight I would write words instead. "Son," I began, and the ink bled into the page like blood finally flowing from an old wound. "I set a table for you. I cooked a feast for you. I waited for you. And when you said you were too busy, I gave that table to the strangers. They weren't family by blood, but they were family in gratitude. I wish you could have seen the way they looked at me, Daniel. Not for money, not for obligation, but for kindness itself." I stopped the pen hovering. The echo of his voice, "Don't expect me," clashed against the roar of applause in the hall. Echo and break the shatter of dismissal, the healing of acceptance. I wrote again. "I don't know if you'll ever understand. Maybe one day you'll sit at your own table waiting for a voice that never calls back. When that day comes, you'll know what I carried tonight." Arc variation pulsed through me, anger giving way to weariness, weariness breaking into calm, calm, trembling into love that still refused to die. "But even if you never come back, I want you to know something. I was proud to be your father. I am proud still. I just had to learn that love is not measured by presents at a holiday, but by the courage to keep giving, even when it's not returned." Tears blurred the ink. I signed it simply Dad. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote his name across the front. Then I placed it in the drawer beneath the table unsent. Maybe it would never leave. Maybe it would wait until years later when someone else found it. But writing it had been enough. Rotation of angles shifted my gaze to Mary's photograph on the mantel, her gentle smile steady in the dim light, then down to the plaque, then back to the folded letter. Three symbols: the wife I lost, the son I might lose, the community I had found. Each told a story, and together they told mine. I leaned back, closing my eyes. The applause still hummed in my ears, mixing with Daniel's words, mixing with Mary's silence. And in that strange chorus I felt both the wound and the salve. The letter lay waiting like a bridge between what had been broken and what might never mend. The letter sat in the drawer like an unsent truth, and I thought the matter might rest there. But life has a way of circling back, pressing the wound just when you think it's healed. 2 days later I heard a knock on the door, slow, hesitant, nothing like the loud summons of neighbors. I opened it and found Daniel standing there, his shoulders hunched under a jacket that still carried the city's dust. His eyes didn't meet mine at first. They drifted to the plaque on the mantel behind me, catching its glint in the lamplight. "Dad," he said, his voice rough. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, and he entered as though into a place both familiar and foreign. He looked around at the table, still holding scraps of the letter, writing night, the cup, the pen, the faint smell of tea. His gaze snagged on the empty envelope I had left atop the drawer by accident. "What's that?" he asked. "Nothing meant to be sent," I answered softly. He pressed his lips together, but said no more. Then he pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and set it on the table. The screen showed photos, faces glowing in warm light, strangers in winter coats, holding plates heavy with turkey pie and stuffing. The community hall, my hall. "I saw these online," Daniel said. His voice trembled. "Someone tagged me by mistake. Said this was the feast at the shelter. Said a man named Max gave everything he had cooked away." I sat down slowly, the chair creaking like it carried the weight of all our years. That man was me. For the first time, Daniel looked at me straight, his eyes wide, unblinking. "You gave it away, yes. To people who said thank you, son. To people who sat together as though every chair mattered." The silence stretched. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, steady as a heartbeat. Echo and break the son who had said, "Don't expect me now," staring at a world that had expected nothing and received everything. Daniel pulled out another photo, a woman in a patched coat, smiling as if she had been given the world. "She looks happy," he whispered. "She is. Because someone thought she was worth the table." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "That's all I ever wanted for you, Daniel. To know you were worth the table." Arc variation cut through his anger, breaking into confusion, shattering into a boy's hurt. He dropped into the chair across from me, his hands covering his face. "Dad, I thought Thanksgiving was just another dinner." "I didn't know you didn't know I finished for him," my own voice breaking. "And I stopped waiting for you to see it. I gave the waiting to someone else." Symbolic variety filled the room, the envelope unopened, the plaque glinting, the phone glowing with strangers' joy. 3 witnesses to the night that had split our lives. "I saw comments, too," Daniel said after a long pause. "People wrote this man gave strangers what his own family forgot. They didn't know it was about me, but I did." Rotation of angles, his shame in his voice, my steadiness in mine, the quiet judgment of Mary's framed smile above us. "I don't know how to fix this," Daniel said finally. His hands trembled on the table. "But I don't want to see my face in those strangers' stories. Not as the son who was too busy." I felt tears sting my eyes, not from anger, but from the deep old wound cracking open. "Then don't let it be the last chapter," I whispered. "The table will always be here, Daniel, but you have to choose to sit at it." In that moment, the house seemed fuller than it had in years the past, the wound, the town's gratitude, and a son's first step back across the distance he himself had built. The feast I had given away returned not in food, but in truth, in the chance for recognition. The house had grown quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. The heavy, aching quiet of abandonment had shifted into something gentler, a space where hope could breathe. Max stood in the living room, his silver hair catching the soft glow of the evening lamp. On the mantel sat Mary's photograph, her smile frozen in a younger Autumn, the kind that carried both patience and promise. He placed a small candle before it, the flame flickering steady against the glass. For a moment, Max simply stood there, rough worker's hands folded together, his shoulders carrying both the weight of loss and the lightness of release. He whispered, as though she could hear him still. I did what I thought was right. I fed the hungry. I opened the table. And our son, he came back at least far enough to see. He let the words linger in the air, then sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the neighborhood, where the last traces of autumn leaves drifted in the streetlight. Somewhere beyond laughter rose faintly from another family's table. It did not wound him this time. Instead, it reminded him that Thanksgiving had always been larger than one house. In the quiet, Max closed his eyes, and a small smile traced his face. He had given away the feast, but in return he had received something far rarer, the knowledge that his story might live on as more than just pain. It might remind others of what really matters. And as if speaking not only to Mary but to everyone who had listened, he whispered the words he had carried for months. Now they know. The story closed there, but Max's heart did not. It remained open to memory, to forgiveness, to the fragile, stubborn hope that family could still find its way home. Dear friends, thank you for walking with us through this story. May it remind you to cherish the tables in your own lives, the faces that sit around them, and the love that cannot be measured in gifts or obligations. I wish you health, peace, and joy in your families. Until next time, take care of each other and take care of yourselves.